Funding for Market Journal is provided by the Nebraska Corn Board.
Growing more with less is the mantra of Nebraska's corn farmers, and they're using incredible technology to do it. Soil moisture monitors let them know when their crop needs water and how much. GPS systems eliminate overlaps in the field, saving fuel and money. New hybrids reduce the use of pesticides and increase yields. When you're talking new technology and innovation, Nebraska corn farmers are all ears. Nebraska's family corn farmers, sustaining innovation.
Market Journal, television for agricultural business decisions, is a presentation of the University of Nebraska-Lincoln's Institute of Agriculture and Natural Resources. Promotional support is provided by the Nebraska Farmer Magazine, and major funding for Market Journal is provided by the Nebraska Corn Board.
Welcome to this week's edition of Market Journal. I'm Bryce Newskin. On this episode, Lee Schulz discusses cattle and hog markets. Keira Lombardo talks about Smithfield Foods pork exports. Greg McKee provides an update on the Section 199A deduction. And Stephen Wegulo gives us an overview of how to scout for wheat diseases. Lee Schulz, Iowa State University Extension livestock economist, is our market analyst this week. Last week, the U.S. Department of Agriculture released the Cattle on Feed report. In the report, USDA estimates there are 11.7 million head of cattle and calves on feed. The inventory was up 9% compared to 2017. Placements in feedlots were up 7% at 1.82 million head. According to Lee, the increase could be a result of the dry conditions in the southern plains, forcing stockers off winter pastures. Meanwhile, the lean hog futures market continues to see a sharp decline in the month of March. The quarterly USDA Hogs and Pigs report is set to be released on Friday. We spoke with Lee Wednesday afternoon and began by asking him about the Cattle on Feed report.
Well, I think it confirmed what we thought. Some inventory levels are higher. You know, we did see much larger number, especially when we look at the placements number. That was pretty wide open going into the report. Pre-report expectations had placements anywhere from same as a year ago levels all the way up to about 8.8% higher. We did see it 7.3% higher. That was higher than the 4.5% coming into the report. I think what that really does confirm, though, is what we've seen, especially in the southern plains, with deterioration of those conditions, really have pushed more cattle into feedlots a little bit earlier. Maybe the cattle that we would have thought coming off of spring wheat would have came in April, May. I think those were put on feedlots maybe a little bit earlier, so that jumped up the placement numbers. But really, when you dig into the placement numbers, I think it's coming from the larger feedlots. In Iowa here, we're the only state that surveys less than 1,000 head feedlots, and those numbers really show placements were down almost 25% compared to last year. So I think it is because of some of the profitability conditions. It is the smaller farmer feeders maybe taking a step back, and the larger feedlots really putting more cattle on feed because of the larger supplies that are out there.
Let's dive in more on a few of those cattle on feed numbers.
When we look at the marketing number, that was probably the closest to pre-report expectations. It was 1.6 above year-ago levels, 1.4% was the pre-report expectation. So there's really no alarming factor when we look at that, but I think that's probably the biggest number to keep an eye on. As we've seen, this last week, slaughter was down 2.3%. The last 3 weeks together, it's been down 1.8%. So probably the biggest concern in this market is we're building these cattle inventories, and the marketing or slaughter pace is slowing down. And so that means these cattle are going to continue to build, and that's going to continue to pressure prices downward. I think the demand is going to pick up as we get into that summer grilling season, but also the supplies are maybe picking up a little bit faster than we thought. So that's a factor that could, impact these markets. Add on top of that, we've seen weight increases. Seen it in the last report that it was up 2.3%. We're 15 pounds above the 5-year average. So that's adding considerable weight to these animals. And so not only are slaughter numbers larger, but beef numbers are larger. So that's impacting the overall beef aggregate supply, and another factor that could somewhat pressure these prices.
You mentioned the prices. How do they respond specifically to the report, and what's your outlook as we continue into quarter number 2 of the year?
Well, if we look at this report, I think most would view it as a rather bearish report, but I think the market was anticipating this. As we've seen the week of that report, prices were down, and so I think a lot of what was already bid into market prices was the bearishness of this report. But we've really seen a downturn in prices. You look back to February 20th, the last time we've seen a peak, we're down $15 per hundredweight over that time period. So we've seen quite a bit of money come off those futures prices. Now, the first 3 months of the year have been fairly profitable for cattle feeders, but as I think we turn into April, we're going to start to see those margins turn negative. One, because feeder cattle prices that at placement were rather high, but also now we're seeing the downturn in these fed cattle futures and cash prices. Also, looking at the difference between that June and April contract, right now it's about a $10 difference. Really the question is, where will that converge? Will the April contract go further downward, or will we see a jump up in that June contract? I think where numbers are really right now, it may be a little bit bearish in the market, and we could see prices suppressed a little bit here in the short term.
Let's shift into the hog side of things. There's a big report due at the end of the week. Remind us the report and its importance.
I think the numbers we really got to keep an eye on is the sow farrowing intention numbers. So if you look at for March and May, that number is expected up 2.1%. June, August, 1.7% up. Those may be a little conservative, at least what we've seen the trajectory the last several reports where intention numbers were smaller than the actual numbers that we've seen post-report. If those numbers in fact are larger, that means pig crops are larger, inventory levels are larger, and the need for growing demand is needed to help hold these hog prices higher. We've really seen hog prices pull back here. This is the first time in a while I've been estimating below break-even profitability for 2018, now just slightly below at $2. But I think there's a lot of factors that could weigh on this market, which could push down especially fourth quarter prices.
Next week, Scott Brown from the University of Missouri will join us to provide his analysis on Friday's USDA Hogs and Pigs report. According to Keira Lombardo, Senior Vice President of Corporate Affairs for Smithfield Foods, a quarter of all pork raised in the United States is exported and shipped to more than 90 countries. As trade tensions across the world continue to rise, she says that Smithfield is working to ensure that export markets remain open. Last week, China announced its intent to put retaliatory tariffs on $3 billion worth of U.S. products, including a 25% tariff on pork. Keira was recently a keynote speaker at the CME Group Foundation Symposium hosted by the Yider Institute. We spoke with her at the event and began our conversation by asking her about the importance of global trade for Smithfield.
Global pork trade is incredibly important to Smithfield and the pork industry generally. About a quarter of all pork is actually exported outside of the U.S. to more than 90 countries around the world. So any growth in the U.S. pork industry is really dependent on exports and access to those markets throughout the world. The U.S. pork industry is projected to grow about 5% this year. There are some new plants that have come online, and that pork just simply has to go somewhere. Americans are not consuming more pork, so we need to send it outside of the borders, outside of the shores of the United States.
According to the United States Department of Agriculture, pork was one of the top U.S. agricultural exports in 2017 with $6.5 billion worth of export goods. Smithfield's top 4 trading partners, Mexico, China, Japan, and Korea, are also among the USDA's top markets for U.S. agricultural exports in 2017. Although pork is ranked 5th out of the top 10 U.S. ag exports, challenges and opportunities can arise and affect the pork export market, including Smithfield Foods.
So the major challenge is the fact that relationships with certain key trading partners are somewhat uncertain. So that goes back to regulation, a lot of the conjecture that's out there. Change is just something that's pervasive in business today and something that I think is difficult to get used to, but it's just part of functioning in the current environment. So any discussions around tariffs or trade agreements that create uncertainty in the market can be difficult to manage through. That being said, exports are a huge opportunity for the pork industry. So it's an opportunity for more jobs in the U.S., it's an opportunity to reduce the U.S. Trade deficit by exporting. I mean, these are things that are very important on the agenda for America today. And as the industry grows and exports more, it helps lower that trade deficit. So it's a huge opportunity for America generally, and also the pork industry, to identify new customers and new consumers in global markets.
According to Keira, Smithfield is responding and adapting to these global demands and connecting with international consumers by communicating and adapting internally in order to maintain their current trade partners, especially when there are added tariffs or specific requirements for pork products.
So there's a number of things that Smithfield is doing to really tap into those export markets and to make sure that important trade markets remain open for our products. So the first thing is really just communication, which sounds very simple, but we spend a lot of time in DC and a lot of time conversing with key government stakeholders to make sure that they understand the importance of trade and how it impacts all the way through the supply chain, how it results in jobs, how it lowers the U.S. trade deficit, and to make sure that that message is really well received and well understood amongst people who are making the policies of this country. So a lot of it just ties back to communication, going down to the local grassroots level in our plant and our farm communities, all the way up to the Hill in Washington, D.C., and even beyond. So that's the first area, is communication, very, very important. The other area is Smithfield has done things to adapt internally. So as an example, Smithfield is vertically integrated, which means that we raise the animals and then we also process the animals, make packaged meats products, and then send those on to the consumers and the customer. So we cover the entire supply chain in terms of our production, and we're able to more easily adapt. We have full traceability of our products. So one area that we've really apply this vertically integrated strategy is ractopamine. Ractopamine is an FDA-approved feed supplement. It promotes the production of lean meat. However, in certain key export markets, China being one of them, they don't allow that supplement. So what we've been able to do is remove that from the feed on our company-owned farms so we can produce that tailor-made product for that country.
As Keira said, ractopamine is a lean muscle growth promoting agent banned in countries such as China. In 1999, the U.S. Food and Drug Administration ruled the product is safe to use in livestock raised for human consumption. You may remember when we spoke with Greg McKee, a Nebraska Extension agricultural and rural cooperative specialist, about the Section 199A deduction in February. Language included in the Tax Cuts and Jobs Act created advantages for farmers selling products to cooperatives instead of private companies. Recently, Congress approved and President Donald Trump signed the omnibus spending bill, which included a fix to the Section 199A deduction. The fix to the so-called grain glitch equalized federal tax treatment of cooperatives and non-cooperatives. We spoke with Greg on Wednesday afternoon to better understand how Congress fixed this complicated issue.
So the Tax Cuts and Jobs Act created a real difference in the corporate tax rate and also the tax rate for individual farmers. So at the corporate tax level, it reduced the maximum corporate income tax rate for traditional, maybe C corporations. But cooperatives aren't taxed under the Chapter C of the tax code. They're taxed under Chapter T ordinarily. There are situations where they can be under Chapter C. So what happened then was, the question was, what can we do to preserve some of the original tax structure that was benefiting both cooperatives and non-cooperative types of firms? The other thing that was happening was that when the Tax Cuts and Jobs Act was passed, this new deduction was created for farmers, which actually really changed things. That deduction hadn't existed previously, and there was a difference in the way the deduction was going to be experienced by farmers depending on whether they sold to an independent or to a cooperative. If they sold to an independent, the farmer had an opportunity to get a deduction of 20% of their net income based on those sales to the independent grain dealer. But for the cooperative, it's 20% of the gross. That's a much larger number, clearly making incentives to market your grain or whatever other output you would have through the cooperative.
Fast forward to the omnibus spending bill, a proposal was proposed and then passed.
Yeah, that's right, and that's where you get a major change. Number one, it did affect the cooperatives at the corporate income tax level again. So instead of keeping that 20% deduction that they used to have with the new 199A, that's been removed. And we're back to the old DPAD days almost, where the cooperative can get 9% off qualified production activities, essentially 9% of the income from grain sales. And then there was the big change for the farmer level. Instead of having access to the gross deduction for sales to the cooperative, now the cooperative members or farmers who sell through the cooperative are on equal footing with the independent sales, in that it's a deduction off the net income, not the gross.
So we're now in March. Will this be retroactive to January?
Yes, in fact, it'll go back to January 1st. That's when the tax law will have to retroactively take effect.
Let's talk about the winners and losers, so to speak, of the results of this getting passed with the omnibus spending bill.
You know, like any good question, the answer is it depends. So as I've mentioned, a farmer is on equal footing with the 20% deduction selling to the independent or to the cooperative. But what happens is, depending on the farmer's income level, that deduction can actually shift slightly. If they sell to the independent, it's 20% off the gross no matter what. But if they sell to the cooperative, it's 20%, but less some issues related to wages and also related to the amount of income they actually earn. If it's more than $315,000, if they're filing jointly, it's a different kind of situation than if they're less than that, and so on. And the other thing that can happen is, because the cooperative now gets its DPAD deduction, and if the cooperative actually arrange its tax strategy to use the DPAD, it can actually pass more through now, because its corporate tax rate is lower in those situations, passing through more DPAD back to the farmer, which actually can be applied on top of the deduction the farmer's earning at the farmer level. So depending on the situation, the farmer can actually come out ahead if they market to the cooperative, or they might actually come out better if they're selling to the independent. It really depends on the tax strategy of the farmer and the cooperative.
Well, Greg, let's talk about some of these practical consequences now for both the co-ops and farmers.
So if you had maybe a $100,000 grain sale and you were going to sell to an independent, your $100,000 would result in maybe $10,000 of income. $10,000 is what your taxable income is. 20% off of that is $2,000. That's your deduction. Same thing would be the case for a cooperative if that was probably all of your sales. That doesn't meet the $315,000 income threshold. But if you were a much larger farmer, and if I read the statistics right, maybe less than 10% of Nebraska farmers will encounter this situation, where if it's more than $315,000 filing jointly, if they've got maybe $500,000 in income from selling to a cooperative, they're going to have to develop their tax strategies very early in the year and probably get some information from the cooperative about what its tax strategy is going to be, so as to be sure to come out at least even, or perhaps even ahead if they can get some of the DPAD from the cooperative itself.
You can learn more about the grain glitch fix and how it will apply to your operation by going to Greg's website at agecon.unl.edu/cooperatives. The economics of feeding cattle can be volatile. Some years the cattle business is very profitable, but other times it is not. If you were to speak with cattle feeders, they would likely tell you the challenging years often outweigh the profitable. Tyler Weberg from Weberg Feeding Company is no stranger to the tough years in the cattle industry. What used to be a small 500-head feedlot in 1972 has grown to a 25,000-head feedlot. Despite the ups and downs of the markets through the 1970s and 80s, Weberg was able to prosper with strategic risk management and cost control. You can read more about Weberg's strategies in the March Nebraska Farmer. You may think that March is the time to begin scouting winter wheat fields, but according to Stephen Wegulo, a Nebraska Extension plant pathologist, April is the best time to start scouting. Stephen says it is important to wait for the wheat to grow in the spring before searching for diseases. Some early season wheat diseases include stripe rust, fungal leaf spots, and powdery mildew. We sat down with Stephen to learn more about these diseases and how producers can scout their wheat fields.
So wheat will be emerging somewhere in March, probably mid to late March. It will be emerging out of dormancy. And at that time, there will be very few disease problems that are visible. So people need to wait until the wheat grows a little bit, and then in April, that's the perfect timing for scouting. And there are two reasons to scout for diseases. One is that you can detect diseases early that then you can plan to control during the current growing season. The other reason is that there are some diseases that you may not be able to control during the current growing season, but when you know that they are there, for example, soil-borne diseases, then you can plan to manage them the following growing season. There are a couple of ways you can do scouting. You can scout the entire field, or if the field is very large, you can divide that field into 2 or 3 sections and then scout each section individually. You determine your pattern that you want to scout and then choose a point at the corner of the field and then follow that pattern. So if it's a zip pattern, you walk and you determine a specific distance that you walk while you are looking at the wheat crop, and then every 300 or 500 feet you stop and then take a more detailed look at the plants in that spot.
According to Stephen Wegulo's Crop Watch article titled Start Scouting for Wheat Diseases, early season wheat diseases in Nebraska are stripe rust, fungal leaf spots, and powdery mildew. Stripe rust, the number one Nebraska wheat disease, consists of yellow rust pustules found on both the lower and upper canopy. Stripe rust can also be found on young wheat, but will not appear as stripes until the wheat plant is mature. The most common early-season fungal leaf spot disease in Nebraska wheat are tan spot and septoria leaf blotch. These fungal leaf spot diseases are not distinguishable during the early stages of wheat development. However, they consist of spots with brown necrotic centers surrounded by yellow halos. These spots start on the lower leaves and progress up the plant, and can also enlarge into large dead areas on the wheat leaves. Tan spot and septoria leaf blotch are the most severe in fields with wheat residue on the soil surface. On the other hand, powdery mildew that contains the characteristics of white, cottony patches of mycelium and condium on the plant surface favors high humidity and can only be found in the lower canopy. Wheat producers should also be aware of wheat streak mosaic and be able to recognize the indications of nutrient deficiencies.
When you see general yellowing and stunting, then that's an indication that you may be having nutrient deficiencies. So at each spot where you stop when scouting, if you see yellowing and stunting, it's a good idea to dig up those plants, a few plants, and examine the roots. When you examine the roots, you may notice that maybe the yellowing could be due to a root and crown rot disease.
According to Stephen, wheat producers should also scout their wheat fields for head diseases. These head diseases consist of common blunt, also known as sinking mut, loose mut, and fusarium head blight, also known as scab.
So with scab, it bleaches the heads, and you'll just see the heads turn white over pretty much short period of time. It's very sudden. So those are the head diseases you look for, but you look for them starting mid-May to early June when the wheat crop is heading.
Now with this week's weather forecast, here's Nebraska Extension ag climatologist Al Dutcher.
Well, folks, here we again for the weekly forecast. And during this last week, most of the major activity was during last weekend. We did see some significant moisture in southeast Nebraska. Although it wasn't enough to eliminate the short-term deficits, we did at least receive in a lot of locations more than an inch of precipitation. And then we had a secondary front come through the state during the midweek period that dropped our temperatures on Thursday. A lot of light shower activity, but no significant moisture with this. We did see some nice rebound in temperatures yesterday, but once again, we are dealing with inclement weather and cooler conditions for the remainder of this weekend. So it's going to be a really rough start, at least for the Easter egg hunters as we go into Sunday morning. So let's take a look at the upper air models and see what we can expect during this week. First thing I'll draw your attention to is the cold air that came in over the last 24 hours. The main emphasis of energy is now poised to our east over the lower Ohio River Valley. We're getting the surface high pressure building in behind us. That's going to create a cool day today. A little bit of wind lightening up as the afternoon progresses, with most of the major snow activity confined across the northern plains. And we are actually looking at a little bit of flurry activity in northeast Nebraska. We go into tomorrow. We see a secondary pulse of energy moving down from the northwest, low pressure in the Dakotas. That should at least spread some snow across the Dakotas and the Great Lakes, with a little bit more flurry activity associated up in the northern Nebraska, And then as we go into Monday, we start to see the trough digging a little bit. This will bring another surge of air into our region. We have surface low basically over Kansas, bringing up moisture from the Gulf of Mexico northward, and this should overlay precipitation across the Dakotas. This may actually sag a little bit farther toward the south and include the northern third of Nebraska, but by Tuesday, the system intensifies and deepens as it moves to the east of us. That means eastern Nebraska will be once again under the influence of cool Canadian high pressure. A little bit warmer temperatures in the west as we rebound back to closer to normal temperatures, but that system is going to generate a lot of heavy precipitation over the moisture-laden areas of the eastern Corn Belt, and that trough hangs around through Wednesday, kind of sits in the same place. That means we'll stay cool in eastern Nebraska, warmer in western Nebraska. A couple surface lows are showing on the maps over the High Plains region, but these are more thermal lows. There's no moisture associated with these systems. Then as we get into the Thursday, we see the ridge trying to build up to our west, but we're still getting reinforcing surges of cold air around that trough as another high pressure system comes in. So we stay cool in eastern Nebraska, maybe getting closer to normal, but another storm system takes shape in the western United States, starts coming on board on Thursday. That's going to push that ridge on Friday closer to our region, and the warmth that is in western Nebraska will spread into eastern Nebraska. We do show a couple surface lows trying to develop, one across the Texas Panhandle. This may result in a little bit of light precipitation in the southern plains, but the heavy moisture remains to our west. Now, if we look at the 8 to 14-day forecast from next Thursday and including through the following Tuesday, we are looking at very cold weather in store for the upper Great Lakes region, warm to the west in terms of precipitation, widespread precipitation. The main culprit is that big storm coming in is expected to generate some significant moisture in the central plains somewhere between April 6th and April 9th. And this is just a warning to the ranchers to pay attention, because this does look like we will see some accumulating snowfall across northern plains, and would not be surprised to see some blizzard conditions develop with this system.
Thanks, Al. Today's interviews are available individually on the Market Journal website and through the Market Journal mobile app. They include information on the latest cattle on feed report, the fix to Section 199A, Smithfield Foods global pork exports, and scouting for wheat diseases. As always, you can keep up with Market Journal during the week by following us on Twitter, Instagram, and Facebook. Next week, Scott Brown from the University of Missouri will be our market analyst. Greg Kruger will discuss the application process for dicamba. Amit Jalla will talk about pre-emergence, and Dave Aiken will give us an update on livestock emission regulations. Until then, thanks for watching. I'm Bryce Duskett. We'll see you next week.
Join Market Journal online at marketjournal.unl.edu. You can also follow us on Twitter, Instagram, and Facebook. Promotional support is provided by the Nebraska Farmer Magazine, and major funding for Market Journal is provided by the Nebraska Corn Board. Market Journal is produced by the University of Nebraska-Lincoln's Institute of Agriculture and Natural Resources.